Go ahead and start it, Kim.
Okay. Are you live?
Yes. Good afternoon, guys. Welcome to episode 9 of Red Door Conversations. I'm your co-host, Lisa White, and I would like to introduce my other co-hosts. We have Kimberly Dixon Dudley coming to you from the Museum District. We have Marla Lewis coming to you from the Clear Lake area. And we have Tana Young, who is from the Woodlands. Tana is having some technical difficulties. However, she is attempting to join the show today, and soon as she joins on, she'll be able to chime right in. So today is part 2 of The Color of Law. And on today's show, we're going to talk about how the IRS has contributed to the segregation of American cities by working together with compliant regulators. We're also going to talk about how banks and thrift institutions have contributed to de jure segregation, which is to legally allow or enforce separation of groups of people. And lastly, but certainly not least, we're going to discuss how local governments throughout the country's use of common segregation tactics. So let's get started, guys. We're going to start off talking about the IRS and the compliant regulators.
Wait, Lisa. We have a red hot topic today.
Oh, man.
So,
thank you.
Well, what you got?
Yes. So
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You are ready to get in. I feel you.
What do you have for us, Kim?
So this is probably top of mind for everybody, because if you have shopped retail today, if you went to your bank, you know your banks are closing early today. I clicked on the Lowe's this morning, and they were honoring citizens for Juneteenth.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And so today, June 19th, is a holiday within the African American community, but it seems like it's catching fire nationwide. And so a lot of people may not even know what it is. So I think it's important for us, if we're going to talk about it just briefly today, to discuss it in context of history, right?
Excellent.
Okay.
So June 19th is the day that we celebrate, but we celebrate the emancipation of slaves in the state of Texas. But if we go back for context, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and put into order in 1863 at the end of the Civil War. But Texas slaves were informed 2 years later, a full 2 years and some change later.
Yeah, it was actually,
Right.
Yeah.
And so, most times if there's any conversation about this, there's two schools of thought. One person may say it's important to acknowledge it. This is important for us not to forget these things. And I agree. And then I hear people say, well, what are we celebrating? Are we celebrating being told late about, are we celebrating Texas farmers having another 2 years of free labor and through enslaved people? And I get and respect both of those opinions, because there's some validity to both of it. Most of the time, people don't want to say, the second part of that, you guys, I was thinking, people don't want to acknowledge the fact that humans were using other humans as cattle. That's hard.
That's a very hard pill to swallow. Yes.
Right. And so it's easier just to say, oh, that happened in the past, not to put it all in the history books, because it certainly wasn't in my history book. Was it in y'all's?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. So, but the part about being told late, to me, and I'm gonna bring this to our realtor business, is that it's almost like not celebrating being delayed justice, but that's what it is. I mean, it's always African Americans having delayed justice, right? So we talked about this on the last show. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866, but we went a full 100 years until the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968.
Right.
Mhm.
African Americans had access to quality housing and lending. So, it's almost a reckoning of delayed justice, right? And so I
Right.
think it's the time for us to, one, acknowledge the pain of it, and two, utilize this as a momentum, as a catalyst to move forward and request and demand change, right? Not just the promise of change, but actual factual change right now, not later, not we'll get to it, but now. So
Now.
I think it's important to acknowledge it, and if it makes you uncomfortable, it should.
So Kim, you acknowledge it, you respect the holiday, but you're kind of indifferent. Is that what I'm getting?
I'm not indifferent, but I have trouble saying Happy Juneteenth.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Why? Tell us why.
Well, I want to acknowledge it. I want to give it the reverence that it's due, but I'm not happy about it, and I don't want anybody else to be happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to
Gotcha.
do something about it,
Mhm.
right? So that I keep seeing people say Happy Juneteenth, and it's just, it almost dilutes the purpose of the day, like the purpose of why people are acknowledging it is because we had these atrocious things happening in our country.
Absolutely.
And we, as a community of people in Texas, were told late. I mean, really important, like Texas farmers had a whole 2 years to harvest and utilize slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think we should have that conversation. That's
correct.
I think for me, I think that's one way to look at it, Kim, but I'm looking at it kind of from a different perspective. I mean, for me, Juneteenth was always big. Me coming up, from a young child, Juneteenth was something that, our family on that day was, kind of like, hey, we're barbecuing. We're celebrating this. And so, although I understand exactly where you're coming from in delay, the delay, however, I'm excited to have other people get on board and to have people
There you
to
go.
acknowledge
Mm-hmm.
what has taken place and the reason that we even celebrate. Now, I know the flip side to that is, I've said, well, why don't we celebrate the actual day and not the day that, we found out here in Texas? But I'm super glad that people are on board. People know what's going on. And I'm super proud of my heritage and what my ancestors did. I mean, I'm proud of that part.
Well, here's the deal. You guys can thank your president because he says he's the reason that so many people know about the day. He's the reason for that. If it were not for him, no one would know about Juneteenth.
Well, hey.
What's the stop? What's the show's topic?
Well, you know what? I say this. However they get it, they've gotten it.
That's good.
So I'm good with that. That's fine.
Yes. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna get it because I'm excited about this information. I feel like everybody should pick up The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. If you don't own that book, if you have Audible on your phone, please order that book, get that book right now and start listening to it because it's going to change your life and how you think about home ownership. Today's focus, we're going to start out focusing on how the IRS worked in cahoots with compliant regulators to yet block out Black Americans from obtaining home ownership. I'm going to start out by reading just a little snippet from what Rothstein says. He notes that the IRS contributed to the segregation of American cities by selectively granting tax-exempt status to churches, hospitals, universities, neighborhood associations, and other groups while supporting discriminatory banks and insurers. So what we're going to highlight today, we're going to talk about how the IRS worked with the churches. We're going to talk about how they worked with the insurance companies. And lastly, we're going to talk about how they worked with banks and thrift institutions. So what what the IRS did as it relates to churches, churches were a big offender as it relates to this. They were always, they were working in cahoots with the IRS to try to restrict blacks from moving into their communities. They felt like even after Shelley versus Kramer had been decided on, Supreme Court had ruled that you can't do that. The churches, they continued to violate this, and they created these neighborhood associations, and that is how the covenants, the bylaws, and restrictions were written to keep black people out. In the book, he gives numerous examples how it was done in the city, in Philadelphia, in Buffalo, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Chicago. It was pastors, priests, and even rabbis. They sued when they got word that black families had moved into their communities where their churches were located. They sued black families for moving into the neighborhood, and or lobbied local governments to mandate segregation. So they were not happy about it at all. And we often see now. Well, my mom used to always say, "Well, it's a church on every corner" type thing. Well, when you went into these predominantly white communities, those pastors and priests, they worked together with the IRS to create documents and neighborhood associations to keep us out of those.
So I think what's important to note there is that this is all being done under the premise that it's one, legal, IRS,
absolutely,
and the church is involved. Right. These two institutions that are highly regarded, right? And we still support. I mean, nobody said that, but it was. I said this in the first show. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right.
That's right.
So I'm interested to see. We're gonna do a follow-up show, you guys, right? But see how some of that stuff has changed. Or do you have some of that information now, Lisa?
Well, let me note that because churches, those were institutions that African Americans trusted. We trust, the church is where we go. That is who, we trusted. And so I was very disheartened to hear that they too worked in cahoots with, the IRS to not allow home ownership or allow Black Americans to move into certain communities. But, not only.
Some of that stuff have some of those laws changed recently in terms of like, if you're discriminating, has the IRS implemented some type of like catch? So if you're discriminating against a certain group of people, then you lose your exemption as a nonprofit or a 501.
Well, yes, there's some, yes, it's some, absolutely, Kim, yes. I mean, today we couldn't do that, but years ago, it was being done. Even after Shelley versus Kramer had been ruled, that the Shelley versus Kramer was a court case that stopped that. And even after that had been ruled on, they were still doing it. There were loopholes. The IRS were able to give these institutions loopholes on how to get around it. That's the key. They would not have been able to do it if the IRS hadn't given them the loopholes to be able to write up their document, their covenants. They wrote it up a certain way to be able to get around that.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was already a court case that had been ruled on and, said that this was not allowable. This was against the law. But as you know, with everything, there's a loophole to get around it. And that's what they were doing. And not only were the churches doing it, the insurance companies were doing it. And the insurance companies were, in fact, they were contributing to the de jure segregation, which I mentioned in the at the beginning of the show. Again, that is when you illegally allow and enforce separation of groups of people. So the insurance companies, they were working with the state governments, and when they were proposing building housing and things of that nature, they had the segregation piece. They promoted segregation. So they gave an example in the book with Metropolitan Life Insurance and how they were building a community in New York. This is in New York City, and it was originally supposed to be whites only, even though the vast majority of the project funding and support were public. So this was a public, yes, this was supposed to be for the public. But once again, the insurance company worked in cahoots with the IRS to allow that building to be white only. And if you go over there, the book notes that in 2010, which was like 10 years ago, it was still completely segregated. So that was just 10 years ago.
Wow. Wow.
There's so much in, in reading the book, there's just so much. I found myself listening to it just, in chunks, just, chunks at a time.
Yes.
Because, again, as I stated on the show, last show, is that, people say, well, why is this relevant now? Why are we talking about it now? Well, the book is relevant now because it brings you up to speed to a lot of things of why, what, and how.
Right.
Whether you are African American, whether you are non-African American, whether you have questions about, well, you know what, why is it like this? Or why, read the book. You'll find out, you'll soon discover. But there's another part of me that is so super proud of my ancestors. I mean, to read through all of this and to find out all that they endured. I mean, I was reading, just looking at chapter 8 and how, there were tactics even using the roads, guys. Come on now. Where, there were regulations that were made where lenders would refuse to make loans to a builder who was building for African American families. Can you believe that?
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy to me, because in this day and age, in 2020, as a real estate broker, think about it. I can't even ask, is the family, what race is the family? So it blows my mind that, way back when, this is what was going on. How did the lender even know what race of family the builder was trying to build for?
And then Marla, it what you're saying, Marla, what you're describing is the next, the next point. It's the redlining and the reverse redlining. All of it was done. They did it all. And if you're wondering what redlining is to refuse to some because they live in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. Okay. And so reverse redlining is the illegal practice of extending credit on unfair terms in a particular community on a discriminatory basis. So I know that's confusing, but redlining means that they were not lending to you at all. They just were not
because of where you
live, right, where you wanted to live. Yeah. Or where here's the deal. Not where you wanted to live, where they made you live.
There you go.
Yeah. That's it. That part where they made
the banks wouldn't lend in those areas. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so reverse redlining is where you have the predatory lending practices that we, meaning they'll lend to you, but it's going to be, as Marla said in our earlier, 24%.
Yes. Unscrupulous.
Yes.
Lending practice.
And we're laughing about it, guys, but it's no laughing matter.
It's really not. It's really not. I mean,
that is how the banks and the thrift institutions, they work together with the government, with the redlining and the reverse redlining. This is what they did to keep us in the area they wanted us to be in, and to at the rate or the cost that they wanted us to pay for it.
So that's, I was reading the book and this part jumped out because they mentioned how the City Planning Commission for Austin, Texas in 1938 went about pushing African Americans to the east side of Austin. And it was so purposeful. It was so strategic. I mean, there was some extraordinary creativity in this. When they couldn't legislate segregation legally, they went to the local folks, like your school boards and rezoning boards, to push people to certain disputes. Went so far as to deny like sewer services and public road maintenance in areas where African Americans were living if they wanted that. So otherwise, then they say, well, if you move over here, then we'll give you some, a new high school or a new hospital. But please note, separate was never equal. So it's not ever going to be on the same standard as over here. But they needed to get these folks out of this community. And they did so by just implementing really strategic local tactics. So when I was reading this earlier and about it was almost tied into like redlining, but so they would deny transportation to African-American families whose kids lived in a certain area. So if your kids don't have transportation to school and they only have transportation to school on the east side, where are you gonna move to? You're gonna move
to the east side, yes.
That's
so,
easy.
You made a good point earlier. For people to have endured, we have complaints that don't have a lot of weight when it comes to our living conditions and our standards. Now, there are issues, real valid issues, right? But to think about, you have all these different apparatuses working against your community, not just you as a whole, your whole community. It was so unsettling. I mean, Texas and some of the other states explicitly used school zoning, which you know this and you think about it, but to read about how strategic they were to close down schools like in the west part of Houston. So early 20th century, they closed down all the schools in the west side of Houston where African Americans attended because they wanted to make that exclusively white.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. And so then, well, the schools are closed and your kids can't go to school. You're going to move where there are schools where your kids can attend. So it was almost it was always chess, not ever checkers. I mean, it was always moving
That's right.
forward to keep folks in a particular oppressed way. Because again, if you're moving to these areas and this is the only place where your kids can go to school, this is the only place where you can go to a park because public parks were closed to African Americans in certain communities. You're going to move to these areas and then there's no services provided.
I was just about to ask you, so what resources were available when they put what did the book speak to about resources that were available or the lack thereof?
So, yeah, Marla, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the resources were from the things that I've read, Lisa, it was deplorable. When trash, I mean, that's just nasty. Y'all know I'm a neat freak anyway. So, I mean, to deny trash services, come on, that goes, that's
pretty low. That's pretty low.
That's pretty low. Yeah.
I'm building development in Southeast Houston, right? And so in doing so, I made it my mission to research, like, what are these residents, what's the history here? And I did not know that there was no public trash service to the Sunnyside area up until in the 1950s area. Like, so people were still having to burn their trash, but they pay taxes.
And they pay taxes like everybody else did, but were not allowed those same services. So,
and this community in the book mentions some Houston communities. It mentions some communities in other areas, but when they did push African Americans to different areas, they were areas where there were landfills and dumps, undesirable areas. In fact, Sunnyside is the home of 280-acre landfill for the city of Houston, right on Reed Road.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about, Lisa?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so you don't have that in different communities because it was not this was purposeful,
That's right.
Sometimes we forget the fact that this didn't happen. The situations that we're in now didn't happen on accident. And you may not be the person who did it, but there are some repercussions that people are living under right now.
Right.
Until we face those things and say them as uncomfortable as they are, we can't change it. We can't just look in our head, understand, and act like things are going to change. So I am so appreciative to have access to this book. And I'm like you, Marla, I have to take it in chunks because it's hurtful and it's painful, but there's a sense of pride that, these folks, they endured a lot of stuff to get today. And
here's the deal. And I say we, because those are our ancestors. We are still making an impact today in the country. In everyday lives, we are still making a huge impact. So just imagine if we were all put on the same playing field, where would we be right now? Where would we be?
Good question.
That's a doggone good question, Lisa.
So
I mean,
this book focuses more on the area of home ownership, but I mean, we've been denied in all areas of life. We've received injustices in just about every category that you can name.
there are some things too, Lisa, that I was thinking about upon reading this, because you're right. There were so many injustices done. There were so many legal, but maybe not so moral things that were done. But in saying that, one, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that, you know, a lot of these things I have not had to endure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so grateful that we're now able to sit and to talk about it and to even see, one, where it was, but two, to talk about where we are now and where we go from here to make things even better. Because once you get an understanding of what has happened, then you can take advantage of the opportunities put before you to make things better. And so that's what, as a real estate broker, you know, the book, you're right, it talks about it from a real estate perspective, which that's what we do. But from every aspect in every area, it should, to me, as hurtful and as painful as some of this stuff is, it should catapult us to be better, do better, and know that we have some opportunity that is out there. I mean, I was back to the denied transportation. I mean, really, I couldn't imagine not having transportation. And at that time, I mean, I guess, you know, public transportation for a lot of people, even now in 2020, that's the way to go. If you're living in that, you know, inner loop area, you may definitely depend on that. There are people working in the medical center that, you know, much rather the public transportation. Can you imagine being denied? I just can't.
Let me read something here in my notes that I have as it relates to the book and home ownership for African Americans. Rothstein notes, he says, unequal access to financial services like home financing remains one of the primary tools industry and government use to perpetuate segregation, and specifically to ensure that African American people remain blocked out of the middle class. Whereas home ownership is a realistic goal for white people who are given mortgages on honest terms, banks use it as a bait to lure prospective African American people into bankruptcy.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's deep.
Yeah.
That's deep.
You know what it does though, you guys?
That's deep.
If people were to look, we didn't learn a lot of this in our textbooks.
No.
You know, a lot of it, like we're seeing people literally, you know, learn in real time. Our country is learning.
That's right.
Real time right now. And so if people were to access resources like this, then they, like I mentioned earlier, they have a context of why things are the way they are. So you don't automatically assume that someone has made a conscious decision to be in a position that they're in. Maybe think about, maybe there are a lot of moving parts that are purposefully pushing that person or that community in that direction. It makes you kind of question things rather than accept the status quo every time. So I think it should be, we said this in the last show, but I think it should be a part of mandatory reading.
Right.
You know,
mandatory.
And let me also share this, guys. I hadn't even shared this with the co-host, but yesterday I received a knock at my door from my neighbor who lives across the street. A very nice guy. We've never had any problems. He and I were